Trails and Ghost Towns with Mike Roberts and Bill Barlee.
Welcome to Gold Trails and Ghost Towns. I'm Mike Roberts, and with me is Bill Barlee, our resident expert when it comes to historical locations, British Columbia and northern United States. I thought we couldn't do another story out of the boundary country, but we are today.
Well, Mike, it's one of the fascinating areas of British Columbia, and really the story we're doing today is on Rock Creek. And I've wandered on Rock Creek since I was a kid, so that's over a third of a century. And it was one of the great gold creeks of British Columbia, discovered before the fabulous creeks of the Caribou, way before Atlin, and the first major rush in British Columbia was to the Fraser River and to Rock Creek.
And we drive by it without even thinking about it.
A lot of people don't know much about it.
Yeah.
Very fascinating creek, intriguing history, and I think we'll find it really quite interesting.
Okay, we'll be back in just a second to take a look at Rock Creek and the gold that was found there when we come back from this break. Don't go away. Welcome back to Gold Trails and Ghost Towns. Mike Roberts and Bill Barlee. All this time I thought Rock Creek was just the place that I stopped to have coffee after completing Highway 33 on the way east.
Mike, when you examine the history of Rock Creek, it has a romantic beginning, it has Bonanza Creek, it has murder, it has intrigue. It really has a fascinating history. Mm-hmm. And, you know, it really starts in 1858. Two American soldiers are stationed in Fort Colville. Now, this is important because the year is 1858, and the frontier's ablaze. There's an Indian chief called Kamayakin, who's one of these courageous Indian chiefs from the interior, and he feels that the Americans are trespassing on hereditary Indian lands, and he sets the frontier ablaze. And so these soldiers want to avoid this conflict. They're dispatch riders, and they're told to go to Seattle. So they start skirting what is assumed to be the Canadian-American border, which is really not very well defined yet. So they head north, and then they head west. And as they come up west, they come into a river called the Kettle, which goes back and forth into U.S. territory and into Canadian territory. And along some days into their trip, they come across a little creek. It's supper time. And as luck would have it, they sit down and have supper, and one of these guys goes down to wash the frying pan, and he thinks, well, I got the frying pan, I'll try he's interested in prospecting. You've heard about the Fraser River Rush, and so he tries a couple of pans full of gravel, and much to his astonishment, there's coarse gold in the pan. And so he calls his other dispatch rider, his friend, and they start panning. They're supposed to go straight on to Seattle. They don't go on to Seattle. They stay there for at least 3 or 4 days, possibly longer. They get a very, very good steak. But on the way, like prospectors everywhere, Mike, they can't keep it to themselves.
It's just too good. This news is too good.
Sure.
Right. Okay.
They come across a Canadian. His name is Adam Beam. And Adam Beam is a prospector. He was going to head for the Fraser River. He hears about this. They draw him a map, evidently. And they say, look, stop at this creek. He said, what's it called? And I think one of the miners, one of these original miners, one of the soldiers, was called York. His surname must have been York. They said, it's York Creek. And, of course, it hadn't a name before that.
Sure. Why not? I mean, it's my creek, it's my gold.
Sure. So he takes credit for it. Yep. Beam comes onto the creek. He finds the creek and starts going to bedrock like all good placer men do. And he starts taking out nuggets to half an ounce, quarter of an ounce. It's really spectacular diggings. And he stays at Soldier's Crossing, which he then calls Soldier's Bar. But he changes the name. He says, to heck with York Creek. There's a lot of rock on this creek, and it's a real problem. We're going to call it Rock Creek. So Rock Creek it becomes. And, you know, the first picture we look at here is Rock Creek really in its original. Yep. This is a picture of Rock Creek Camp, 1861. And the first few years, 1858, 1859, and right into 1860, very, very busy camp, Mike. And what happened was this. It is so close to the U.S. border, it is so close, that the Americans come flooding in. They think it's their camp. And this is interesting because what happens in 1860, they're prepared to secede to the United States of America.
They don't make a little jog north of the 49th parallel because this is close enough to ours.
Well, sure, it's close enough they can grab it. Yeah. And it's rich diggings. They want it. But word gets to a guy called William George Cox, who's the gold commissioner, very interesting guy. He informs the colonial government, which is really Governor James Douglas. Yeah. Now, this is so serious that Governor James Douglas comes all the way overland, comes into Rock Creek to quell what they call the Rock Creek Rebellion. He gets all these miners together, and they say, you know, we're American miners, and we're going to take this out of Canada. We're going to go to the States. And he says, you're not going to go anywhere. He said, this is British territory. If I have to bring in the Royal Marines, I'll do it. And he lays the law down, and he does lay the law down, and at the end of the speech, they give him 3 hurrahs. So he has really carried the day. Rock Creek stays in Canadian hands, but the interesting thing about the creek is this, Mike. And when we take a look at the second picture here, you'll see that the creek comes down, and this is about 7 miles from its mouth, and here is McKinney Creek joining Rock Creek, which was also called Jolly Creek. So it's joining the main creek.
This is steep, angular country. These creeks are really creeks, very small freshets running down these hills.
Yeah, they are. You know, the creek really goes west, and then it wheels north into that Mount Baldy country and into the old Camp McKinney and all that fascinating area up there. So it's hard rock country, it's placer country, and all the rest. And what happened was this. So the first members of these guys who come into the creek, they flood into Soldiers Bar. But they find that, you know, there are too many miners. There are about 400 or 500 miners here, Mike. And so they've got to start going up the creek. They go up the creek for a couple of miles, and there's virtually no ground because the bedrock was too deep. So they go up past Johnson Creek, and they get a little bit of gold at the mouth of Baker Creek, a little creek coming in here. But as they make that big wheel, that turn up towards the north, they start coming across spectacular ground. This is just great ground. It's bonanza ground. It's ounce-a-day diggings. And ounce-a-day diggings, Mike, means that the average guy was probably making about 75 cents a day. Suddenly they're making $16 a day or $15 a day. So they're making 20 times their ordinary salary. Yeah. And this is just astonishing. This means today it's equivalent to about $1,000 a day. It is really quite spectacular.
Bonanza gold, as you said it. What do they call this bar?
Well, the second bar they hit is White's Bar.
White's Bar.
And that's named after an American miner called White. And it is several thousand ounces come out of White's Bar. And then they go up the creek, and then they go up the creek, they find high diggings on either side. Then they come to the best bar of them all. And this is Denver Bar. Yeah. A guy from Denver, Colorado discovered it. He names it Denver Bar. They get nuggets there, Mike, up to 6 ounces, 1/2 Troy pound. And they get 5,000 ounces out of Denver Bar. But the gold stops abruptly at Denver Bar, just like you draw a line there. So they're confused by this, and we'll get to this later on. But what they do is they keep on going up, and they go right up to what was called the Old England property.
Yeah. When you say, for example, that the gold, or it didn't go to bedrock, what do you mean it didn't go to, did bedrock disappear, or what?
Bedrock in the ground between Baker Creek and the mouth of the creek, which was Soldiers Bar, was so deep. So deep.
Well, there's so much gravel from the surface down to bedrock.
150, 200 feet. We don't know. Nobody's ever tapped the bottom there.
Well, why don't they just dig? I mean, what's to stop them from just digging?
It's too difficult because, first of all, if you dig gold that deeply, Mike, if you dig for placer gold, you've got all sorts of problems with water.
Of course.
And, you know, you've got over 100 feet of overburden, and generally the thumb rule in placer mining is don't dig too much overburden, or you're going to go broke, and you're going to go broke in high style. And so this creek, you see, is a very interesting creek. So what happens in the 1860s, the creek is flooded with American miners. A lot of them go back to the States. They never have to work again. They have done extremely well in Rock Creek, and this is a creek that has 2 runs of gold. It has a lemon yellow gold on the high run, but when you get down into the very rich ground, Mike, it has a coppery gold.
We got a pan of gold here, as a matter of fact, and I'm just going to grab it here because this is actually gold from that location, and you can actually see dump water on myself. You can actually see the different colors in here. There's a blonde kind of lemony gold, and there's a dark coppery color gold in there.
Yeah, there are 2 types of gold.
So that would lead you to believe that these are coming off 2 different deposits.
2 different time eras. You know, I mean, one is probably several thousand years ahead of the other, and definitely from 2 specific areas, undoubtedly.
How much gold do we have in this pan?
We have a 1/4 of a pound almost exactly in that pan. A 1/4 of a pound Troy is 3 Troy ounces, because 1 Troy pound is 12 Troy ounces, which is different than the standard ounce.
Now, I noticed that there's gold floating in this pan. Now, that's something which the surface tension is actually keeping some of these little flakes afloat.
Yeah, you find that gold will actually float out of the pan if you're not very careful. And so this is surface tension. You touch that gold, it'll disappear to the bottom, of course.
And there it goes.
There it is, you see.
All right.
And
so we got to Denver. Is that where we are?
We're at Denver Bar. But what happens is this, is that the Chinese hear about Rock Creek, and the Chinese, of course, are some of the great miners of British Columbia. They come into Rock Creek and they start gleaning the diggings that the whites have left behind. And, you know, they come into that old property up there, way up at the top of Rock Creek, that is the kind of the Old England, is referred to as the Old England. And that's a hard rock property, but just below it, the Chinese were working there for years. And I contacted one of the individuals from Brideville. Brideville is fairly close by. And he said, you know, very interesting, Bill. He said, what happened there? He said, the first Chinese came in the 1860s. My grandfather provided them with all their food.
Yeah.
And he said, the first Chinese who came in, they lived high off the hog. They had beef and all the trimmings, and boy, they stayed there a couple of years and cleaned it up. Then another group of Chinese came in, about 10 or 15 years later. His grandfather was still supplying them. Yeah. And this time, they didn't have beef. It was a little tougher digging. They had chicken and the trimmings, in other words, vegetables.
Yeah.
And then another group came in about 10 years after that. Grandfather's still there. So this time, these guys had a tough time. They didn't have beef. They didn't have chicken. They only had some of the trimmings. So that it was tough ground by then. Three groups of Chinese had come in, and first group done very, very well, judging from their habits. Second group had done relatively well. Third group was practically starved to death.
So whatever meager provisions they had, they probably cooked in an item just like this.
You bet.
Just a few veggies in the bottom. That would not keep me looking for gold.
Yeah, it was tough country, Mike. It was tough economically, and it was tough as far as law and order was concerned. You know, in that early Rock Creek in the 1860s, there were a number of murders, a lot of gunplay, and one significant murder where a miner was killed, an American miner, by an Indian. Now, there were some great Indians in that area, but, you know, one was Chief Tanaska, who was a noble Indian, but there were a few renegades. And this is one of them, and he killed this American miner and then went over the top heading for the Okanagan. Well, the American miners chased him over the top, caught him at Suyas Point, which is now Suyas, and they lynched him there. Well, this disturbed Governor Douglas. He'd been there for the Rock Creek Rebellion, and there's a murder, and he says, we're going to solve that. He starts the Dewdney Trail, which is eventually to go right from just outside of Fort Hope all the way through the Wild Horse. Interesting thing about the Dewdney Trail, Mike, it's just north of the border. It keeps that country British. He was a very far-sighted individual, really quite a fascinating character. And so we had that, you know, the 1860s era. Then we get into the 1890s.
Rush is not over in 1860?
Not by a long shot.
All right. When we come back after this break, a look at rush number 2, or maybe rush number 4, considering all the rushes the Chinese had in the area. Back with more Gold Trails after these words. Welcome back to Gold Trails and Ghost Towns. Talking about Rock Creek, it's salad days, I guess, the 1860s, but interest did not end with the 60s. What brought them back?
Well, Mike, the depression of the early 1890s, which really began in 93. So some of the Chinese were still there, and this shot shows a few of the Chinese working in the lower stretches of Rock Creek. This is 1895, and they're hydraulicking, one of those banks which has a little bit of gold in it, but hydraulicking was the most efficient method of mining, so they managed to glean their, some earnings from this rather last of the attempts at Rock Creek by the Chinese. And the next shot is kind of interesting, too, because it shows some other activity in the area. And these are wagons coming into Rock Creek, which has changed slightly. And they're carrying equipment for the mines, and there's now a hard rock interest there as well. But, you know, it's interesting because it's still a violent camp, even by the turn of the century, because just after the turn of the century, an outfit came in, and interesting part about it was that there was a guy called Charlie Vetter in charge of this outfit. He was kind of the camp manager, and he had some backers, and the backers felt that they weren't getting enough gold. That was the rumor that still circulates in that old country down there. And so the miners took their lunch break, and Charlie Vetter goes into the building, which is still standing, by the way, Mike, still standing at Rock Creek. And after lunch, one of the miners wants to talk to Charlie Vetter. He walks into the building, and Charlie Vetter is sitting very calmly in a chair, but there's a little problem here. Charlie Vetter has a hole right between his eyes. And everyone swore they hadn't heard a shot. Well, there were no silencers in Rock Creek just after the turn of the century. So somebody put Charlie Vetter away, and probably because he was high grading.
He was stealing from the rocker boxes or the sluice boxes
or
something. This little weapon reminds me, it's an excellent component of this thing. What caliber is this?
That's a probably a 32, and it's 1858. It was probably actually manufactured in 1860. This is the type of gun that the early American miners would have carried into the Rock Creek area.
It's not quite the buntline special that I, have come to associate with sort of the American West. Very much more delicate, useful, not obtrusive.
That's right.
Efficient.
That's very, very beautiful gun, actually. And, this is a fascinating area because...
Think this maybe bumped off Charlie Vedder?
I don't know. Was that one or what bumped off Charlie Vedder? They never found the murderer, Mike. They never found the weapon, and all the evidence disappeared.
So Law and Order, Douglas may have thought he brought Law and Order in, but occasionally Law and Order took care of itself.
Yeah, indeed. In the mining camps it did in those early days.
How big was that 90s rush? Was it just a stopgap?
Probably about 100 men working on the creek, Mike. And, there were a lot of guys interested. There were still been there since the early days. Old Jimmy Copeland had come there in about 1860. He dies in Rock Creek in 1899. And Handsome Rory McLeod, who used to be in Ainsworth, he came into Rock Creek in his waning days to try to glean a living from that particular area. And, there are a lot of interesting stories on the creek itself. I was talking to a miner about 10 years ago who was working on the upper part of the creek near Denver Bar, and that's very fascinating. And they had a tunnel right into the side on the north side of Denver Bar, and they were tapping the old run on Denver Bar, and ordinarily they operated by the clock. They were taking out wheelbarrows full of gravel, and they averaged about $1.50 a wheelbarrow load. This is the 1930s, Mike, the depression of the 1930s. And that was good pay, so they stayed at it. They always started about 8 o'clock in the morning, worked till noon, and then took their half-hour lunch break. That's all they took, and then worked till about 6 o'clock. And then one day his partner said to him, he said, Peter, let's take a break. Let's take a break a few minutes early today. They stopped at 10 minutes to 12. Sat down for a minute. Boom. That's all they heard. Whole tunnel completely flat. And they'd shored her up. They'd done all the timber work, but for some reason, this other guy had a premonition, and what they did, Mike, they had a fairly good stake. They'd done pretty well. They picked up their gold, they picked up their tools, and they walked away from it.
Oh, that's just the fates talking to you, eh?
Yeah, the guy was very lucky. Remembers it to this day, still alive, too. And another guy I remember, in Rock Creek, an old guy called Ralph from Christina Lake, and he was up there for years, up by the Old England claim, which was really the last of the great placer claims on the creek.
That's just below the hard rock working.
Yeah, that's just below. Generally, it's known as the Old England. And I used to go in and see this old boy, and I'd say, hey, Ralph, how you doing? This would be maybe 30 years ago. And he said, oh, Bill, I'm not doing too bad. He said, I got 2.5 ounces this summer. Well, that's not very much. And, I was at $35 an ounce, and I said, well, what are you heading for? He said, the Chinese just stopped here. He says, I'm about 8 feet from their workings. So I'd go in 2 or 3 years later, and I'd say, how you doing, Ralph? Well, Bill, he said, I've got about 3 ounces this year. And I said, well, that's not it. Didn't you get... No, he said, Chinese went a little farther. He said, I thought they were going to stop here. I'd go in 3 years later, and they say the same thing.
Just a couple ounces a year.
He never hit it.
He never did.
He stayed there for 43 years.
The things gold will do to you, eh?
Sure.
The lure of always going to come across that really rich run.
Yeah, well...
Is it still there?
Yeah, there is one place that really intrigues me on the creek, Mike. And this map we're showing here will give you an idea. And the map actually indicates very near Denver Bar. Denver Bar is just across the creek. 5,000 ounces came off Denver Bar, and Denver Bar was really the granddaddy of all the bars in Rock Creek. Nuggets up to 6 ounces. And I mentioned before in the program that the run stopped. So the old miners are very curious. So they knew it stopped. It had probably gone somewhere, either to the right or to the left, to the north or to the south. So they began tapping into that either side of the creek, and they came across some absolutely spectacular ground on the north side of the creek. Well, actually on the northeastern side of the creek. And they began putting in adits or tunnels in there, and they put in about 9 or 10 tunnels in there. In fact, some of these guys did so well, they took 1,100 ounces out of one tunnel. And this was very coarse gold, Mike. It was old gold. And so between Denver Bar and the Old England claim, that run trends off towards kind of the northeast. And you can see the tunnels are all gone now. They're caved. But that's where, and there's a little cabin right by Denver Bar today, kind of a neat little cabin. The holder of that claim still has the cabin. And I'm convinced, as are a number of individuals who know Rock Creek extremely well, Old Man Locke from Penticton, he gave me all his mining notes on Rock Creek. before his death some years ago. He knew I was interested in mining, and in his will, he actually said, Bill, I want you to, he told his son he wanted me to get all his mining stuff from Rock Creek, and he'd worked on Rock Creek for many years and also worked on McKinney Creek, which was a little tributary, and he was convinced that there was an old run to the northeastern side just off Denver Bar, and from the preliminary work, there is. So somewhere just beyond Denver Bar, about maybe 150 yards north.
It's upstream?
Upstream, yeah,
okay.
Upstream, north and east.
Taking notes here.
That's right, and you'll see a big gravel bank, and very interesting gold came out of there, and I think that run trends on that, but where it comes out, where it came from, nobody really knows. It's really a fascinating area.
Well, but with gold now at 300 and whatever it is, 370 bucks an ounce, doesn't it behoove somebody to go in there? Is this easy country to work? Is this gravel? Is this hard rock? What are we working on here?
Well, Mike, what you're looking at is terrific overburden, and you cannot afford, first of all, to move the overburden, and secondly, where do you put it? You know, in this day and age where you have to be very careful in the environment. So I don't know whether they're going to follow that with a long, long tunnel, which is extremely expensive and
dangerous from these other guys' experience.
Sure it is.
It's shored up as well as it is. It's still going to go oomph.
That's right. And, you know, I think this country itself is very interesting. And here we take a look at a shot here, and what you see really is an old barn, and this overlooks one of the tributaries of Rock Creek. And this particular tributary is a very interesting tributary. This is called McKinney, named after, well, the camp was named after him as well, so he was an early miner into the area. And this old barn, found a $5 gold piece in this barn some years ago, a guy from Summerland, B.C., and the creek itself is really quite interesting because McKinney Creek, unlike Rock has some cabins on it, McKinney Creek has a lot of cabins on it. And here we'll see a picture of one of the cabins in the upper part of McKinney Creek. Roof's gone, the cabin's in very, very poor shape, and but you move down a little bit down McKinney Creek, come down the old Miners Trail, see another cabin. And here's the roof of the cabin, and dug right in, almost right to the ground level itself. And then you see the front part of the cabin, and just close to this cabin are the old tailings. And McKinney Creek's different than Rock, Mike. Rock Creek was very, very rich, but tended to be spotty in high runs and low runs. McKinney Creek tends to be very spotty. So, you know, the whole area is really quite fascinating. You have still some gold on McKinney Creek, selected spots in Rock Creek, not as good as it used to be, except for that old high run coming off Denver Bar.
Yeah, that's up there. Too much overburden, but one day somebody may figure out how to get at it.
Yeah, if they can trace it, they may go at it from the other side. They may go over top of the ridge and see what's on the other side.
All right. Rock Creek, an area which you've stopped at. If you've been heading into Trail and Castlegar area, probably had a coffee there.
Sure.
And gone there for the fall fair. A much more fascinating story than we realized before. Thanks very much, Bill.
You're welcome, Mike.
Bill Barley, our guest and host and tour guide for Gold Trails and Ghost Towns in British Columbia. And we'll be back next time with another story from that